Alrighty, so we will get started. First off, welcome everyone to the 9th virtual event in our 2020-2021 History Talk Speaker Series. My name is Felicia Cameron, and I am the Museum Assistant and Educator. This evening, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The museum is on traditional territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Nisqually and Squaxin Island peoples. Lacey and the South Puget Sound region are encompassed by the Treaty of Medicine Creek, signed under duress in 1854. We respect and affirm tribal sovereignty, and as part of the City of Lacey, we work with the Nisqually and Squaxin Island tribes in government-to-government partnership. And before we begin the program, I'd like to share a variety of museum news. Here. Okay, so people are wondering when the museum is going to be open, and I am pleased to share that we have a target opening date of July 1st. And since a lot can happen between now and then, this is just a target date. And although the museum has been closed since March of last year, we have been keeping very busy at the museum. We continue to accept artifacts for donation, work on making collections accessible, and help customers with their research inquiries, among many other things. We are also working on a project to document this time that we have been going through, and we are asking people to submit their photos and share what they have been doing during the pandemic. So here are a couple of examples. The photo on the left is a photo submitted by Cynthia Pratt. She is getting caught up on her pile of books to read. And on the right, submitted by Jennifer Welts, her family is enjoying a picnic lunch in their backyard. We'd love to have more of these photos, so please send them our way, and then we can add them to our collection. All right, so the next thing I would like to share is a new museum project. Already on the site is the Lacey Train Depot and the adjacent train-themed playground on Pacific Avenue. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, I encourage you to take a walk on the Karen Fraser Woodland Trail to see for yourself, especially now since it is spring and we have gotten some nice sunny days. The food truck court has opened next to the Lacey Train Depot, and I have personally gone down myself to check it out a couple times, and the food is very delicious. Another fun development we are currently working on is putting together a scavenger hunt about historical places and figures related to Lacey. It will begin at the train depot and end at Woodland Creek Community Park. It will begin the last weekend of May and will be up for 2 weeks. Alrighty. The depot and playground are part of what will become the whole museum campus. Here is one of our latest renderings of the new museum. We are on schedule to be at 100% design by May, so this month. We have written a grant to help fund the site preparation, including taking down the existing warehouse building. We're feeling very optimistic since the budgets in both the House and Senate include this grant program fully funded. We will find out for sure if we get that in June, and if we do, that work will begin at the beginning of 2022. Okay. So today's presentation is the last history talk in this season, but we will begin our next season of history talks in September of 2021. We already have several really fascinating speakers lined up. And like with our past history talks, you can register for future programs when they become available by going to our website at laceymuseum.org and then click on events. And alternatively, you can visit the City of Lacey Facebook page where all of our speaker events are posted. Okay, and lastly, for those of you who have come to see our in-person history talk speakers, you'll know that the Q&A portion of the talk is definitely a highlight, and we would like to keep that portion alive. So this evening's Zoom meeting is set up webinar style. So there's not a chat box like in regular Zoom meetings, but we do have a Q&A button. For most of you will be at the bottom of your screen. So for the most part, we will be holding questions until the end, but anytime you do have a question, go ahead and post it in the Q&A section and we'll circle back around to it at the end. Okay, so now let me introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Josephine Taylor III. So Josephine Taylor III teaches history and geography at Simon Fraser University. Jay studied at the University of Oregon and received his PhD from University of Washington in 1996. His research focuses on contests over natural resources in the North American West, including fisheries, outdoor recreation, gentrification, and conservation. His first book, published in 1999 by UW Press, was Making Salmon: An Environmental History of the Northwest Fisheries Crisis. It won the George Perkins Marsh Prize for Best Book in Environmental History and Choice's Top 10 Books in History of Science. In 2010, Pilgrims of the Vertical, Yosemite Rock Climbers and Nature at Risk, published by Harvard University Press, received the National Outdoor Book Award for Best Book in History or Biography. And Persistent Calling, Seasons of Work and Identity on the Oregon Coast, published by OSU Press in 2019, was just listed as a finalist for the Francis Fuller Victor Award for General Nonfiction. Excuse me. Jay is also lead author for the Follow the Money project at Stanford Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis. The site tracks the history of transfer payments from federal land management agencies to the 414 counties of the American West. His current project is a history of Congress and federal conservation from 1783 to 1941, titled 47% of the West, Congressional Conservation During the Long Progressive Era from 1861 to 1939. The reason for Jay's talk tonight, however, is that he was also an expert witness in the early 2000s for U.S. versus Washington, commonly known as the Culvert Case. And his research on salmon runs and attitudes about the fishery played a key role in Judge Ricardo Martinez's summary judgment of August 2007. So Dr. Taylor, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today, and we're very honored to have you speak with us.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen right now so that we can switch over, but I want to thank you, Felicia, and also Aaron Quinn-Valcho for helping set up this talk tonight. I also want to give a shout out briefly to Albert McConaughey, who helped me flesh out the parameters of this talk back in February to begin with. What I want to do today is give a brief background to for anyone who doesn't know what the Culvert Case is about, and then move from there into really the nerdy question of how one goes about establishing what the world was like in 1854 and 1855 and why that matters to understanding this case in particular. So with that, allow me to go over here real quick. To begin with, we should remember that the pretext for all this was that Congress and the president tasked the territorial governors of Oregon Territory and Washington Territory, Joel Palmer and Isaac Stevens, to go out in 1854 and 1855 and establish title to the lands of the region. This is the basic process by which the nation state gained title control of lands in this area. And it's an imperfect and sometimes rather ugly story, but it's also the pretext for everything that follows. What I'm going to be focusing on today, though, is the left side of this map, really Western Washington Territory, as it drains either into the Pacific Ocean or into the Puget Sound region, because that's where the focus of the Culvert Case would be, end up being with the treaties. What follows in late 1854 and early 1855 is a rush of 4 treaties very quickly within just a little over a month, and then a 5th treaty within a half a year that largely cede nominal control of the territory to the United States government in this respect. The key issue for the federal government and for both Stevens and Palmer was getting title to the land. In the process of that, they begin to realize very quickly, especially through conversations between Stevens and the governor of the Vancouver Island colony, James Douglas, that what was going to be at stake was not so much title to the land as access to resources. And Stevens ended up borrowing language from Douglas that Douglas himself had borrowed from negotiators in New Zealand. So there's a real transnational history to what follows. And the key thing was a passage that shows up in all these treaties and others as well, essentially guaranteeing to the signatories the right to take fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations, or something along those lines. And you'll find that in some fashion or another here. And that's half of the key phrasing that matters for us going forward. The other half was the guarantee that they could take fish in common with all citizens of the territory. What that meant is going to begin to be tested in the late 19th century in federal courts and then state courts as well across the 19th and 20th century. And it's key to understanding how the interpretation of these treaties would evolve within the federal courts all the way to the Culvert case. And really this begins in an important case that's not often very well recognized, which is United States versus Taylor. It's brought to court in 1887 and involves the Yakimas on the Columbia River and an effort by Frank Taylor, a property owner, to exclude the Yakimas from some of their usual and accustomed stations. The ruling in that, followed up by US v. Winans in 1905, established a couple of very, very important premises going forward. The first is that the treaties that were made with the various tribes in Western Washington were not treaties that accorded rights to Indians, but rights that had been reserved by the Indians before they made the treaty. And that's a key feature of all this. This is never about rights that were given by the federal government. It's rights that are reserved. And the reserved rights doctrine becomes very important here. And then it's followed up in 1908 by a separate decision, Winters v. US, that involves a water case in Montana. But those three cases solidify both the notion of reserved rights, but equally important, the practice of understanding the meaning of treaties through the eyes of the Indians who signed it. And these become baseline, foundational principles of understanding these treaties going forward from this period. From that point on, it becomes a question of enforcement, and Lummi Indians will start running test cases in courts beginning in 1906. In 1916, a Washington state court in Washington v. Toasnute will essentially deny Indians any of these rights, and this becomes the basis for an ongoing contest for much of the 20th century, really, over whether these treaty rights actually have any substantive meaning. During the 19-teens and the 1920s, the Washington Fish and Game Departments would relentlessly insist on Indians abiding by state laws. Indians will resist this. In 1942, another case pushed forward by the state of Washington, it comes to be known as Thule versus Washington, will be decided by the Supreme Court. It kind of is a split the baby story in which it will reaffirm the rights of Indians, but it will also grant to the state of Washington a exemption in case of conservation. During the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, Washington will use that conservation exemption to continue to try and restrict Indians in ways it wasn't restricting other people. And this is what leads to the famous fish-ins of the 1960s, in which Indians, especially the Nisquallies, the Puyallups, the Lummis to a certain extent, will all begin to challenge this policy to try and create test cases to bring forward. Over the course of the 60s, it gets pretty violent. And by the early 1970s, the violence has escalated by the Fish Commission. And one consequence of this is that the federal government will agree to consolidate all these complaints into two really important cases moving forward. The first actually takes place in Oregon in the late 60s. It's called So Happy versus Smith. And in 1969, Judge Robert Maloney will rule that Indians are largely exempt from state regulations. And this is primarily addressing what's going on in Oregon at this time. And that they do have a right to fish in common with other people on the rivers, and by their own rules to a great extent, with the conservation principles still acknowledged from Thule in all this. And that hangs fire until 1974, when Judge George Bolt will rule in Washington District Court in US v. Washington, what comes to be known as the Bolt decision, where he goes much further in terms of interpreting the treaties, insisting that it's not simply that Indians are exempt from state regulation other than conservation concerns, but also that Indians have an individual right or a separate right to manage their own fisheries when they have that capacity, that the meaning of in common is much more specific by this point in time, and it means 50% of the allocation. And finally, he also, in this ruling, suggests that the treaty also imposes an expectation that there will be fish, that the treaties actually have implications for salmon habitat moving forward. Now, this will be tested in the circuit courts in 1976. I'll be revisited again in Washington versus the passenger fishing vessels in 1979, and then something called Phase 2 in 1980. And by the end of this, Bolt's decision and Bolt's interpretation has gained a tremendous amount of standing and has resisted a whole lot of challenges across time. And this is really important because going forward in the 1980s, these three principles of separate from state regulation, capable of becoming co-managers of the fisheries, and the implications of habitat will be the order of the day until 1993, when Barbara Rothstein, in a district court in Washington, will revisit the question of habitat. And that at that point, she will vacate that part of Bolt's decision, in her words, without prejudice, simply because she didn't see the standing for that particular ruling in the original case. And that's really the pretext for everything that follows, is Rothstein's rule basically sets aside, but does not pass judgment on the question about habitat. In the meantime, I had originally been in the fisheries in the 1970s and 1980s when these rulings came down, and I watched the anger radiate in many different directions. It's a complex story that I don't think has been told very well, and I'm happy to talk about it more in question and answers. I'm not going to spend much time here talking about it. But eventually I got back in school, finished 2 degrees at the University of Oregon, and by 1992 was working my PhD at the University of Washington. So I was in Seattle when Rothstein made her ruling, and I thought it was very important and very interesting at the time, and kind of opened up a question that still needed to be answered. But I was busy doing my dissertation on the history of the salmon fisheries and salmon fishery management in the Northwest at that time. In 1999, I published this book. In 2000, I went to a conference in Tacoma. And while I was there, I got invited to a breakfast with some lawyers for the tribes. And they told me that they had found a way to actually test the principle that had been vacated by looking very specifically at road culverts that were a widely known problem in terms of maintaining salmon runs and salmon habitat, and very specifically about state sovereignty in this case. And they wanted to know if I would be interested in writing a report on habitat and attitudes about salmon back in 1854 and 1855. And my one stipulation to them at the time was I was very interested in doing this, but I had to be allowed to do this as a scholar, which is to say I needed to be allowed to look at all the evidence, whether it confirmed or complicated their arguments. And to my surprise, but really it shouldn't have been, they were more than happy to agree to that. So on that basis, I went back to the archives and began to work through a whole bunch of material involving Western Washington that I really hadn't looked at in my either my dissertation or in the book. And in 2004, I submitted my report to the tribes. And in 2005, they submitted it to the courts. And then in 2007, Ricardo Martinez, responding to a request for a summary judgment, ruled in the tribe's favor on all issues. And at that point, my official capacity in these cases was over. I was simply an expert witness, and moving forward, it would increasingly be tested on constitutional principles. And thus in 2016 and 2017, Washington appealed to the Circuit Court, the Ninth Circuit Court, and then in 2018 to the Supreme Court. And all three courts sustained Martinez's decision, which is how the Culvert case still stands to this day at this point. In other words, the upshot of this was that over this long period, the understanding of those treaties has been extended not simply to the right to take fish, but also an implicit right that there will be fish, which means there will be healthy habitat in the region. What I want to do today is go back and for the rest of this time is to talk about the process I went through in my research. I am by nature, I thought I was a jock growing up. I am actually a nerd. And I really found my sweet spot when I finally went to the archives. And this is a photo from a long time ago of me in the National Archives. It still hangs there, actually. But for me, it was going back to my happy place, going back to the archives and digging through lots of old documents back from the 1840s and early 1850s. But throughout my entire research, what I needed to remind myself is that this was the context that mattered. It's what's going on in 1854 and 1855 that really matters to the courts in understanding these treaties. And thus, for a researcher like me who likes to talk about change over time, it's kind of a maddening process because I saw so much in the documents I couldn't do anything about because I was like a trotter horse. I had blinkers on and I had to look very narrowly in terms of the two guiding questions. What were those guiding questions? Well, these were first was what was the status of salmon, other fish species, and habitat in 1854 and 1855? And the second, which I'm not going to talk about today, what were the views about the future of salmon runs and salmon fisheries in 1854? Each required a different approach. And the first is a very material question about fish and ecology. The second is much more about attitude. So they required very different approaches to this. I'm going to focus on the first because I think it's an interesting way of getting at this. And it also opens up the complexity, the strangeness of the past during this period. Begin with one of the more invaluable resources that I found were the cadastral surveys that were being done, produced at the time of the treaty negotiations. Stevens, when he came west as the new territorial governor, had joined the transcontinental railroad surveys that were taking place, and especially the northern route. There were 4 routes in total, but the northern route, he accompanied that. And when he got to Washington Territory, the surveyors did not leave. They just turned around and began to survey the landscape of Western Washington in particular at this point in time. I want to start with Township 18 North to west of the Willamette Meridian, produced on February 11th, 1854, before the treaty negotiations begin. In other words, Bud Inlet, Olympia, and Newmarket at the time, and the Tumwater settlement. Because here we can already see some really interesting and really complicated problems in terms of interpreting what's happening on the ground at this point in time. I want to focus particularly on the Deschutes River and the mills on them. This is a photo from about 40 years later. It's the ford on the Deschutes River above the First Falls. This is probably late summer. You can still see the gravel bed that ran through this place. We'll come back to another shot of this very spot in a moment to make a point here. But among the things you can see is the water's still really clear. This is not a very big stream. It's not running very fast. This is probably summer and a lower flow going on, but you can still see gravel through the water in the stream at this point. If you do a close-up of this, this is where that ford was. It's above a lower mill and below the upper falls in this way, and we'll get back to that in a moment. This is the cutout of this particular area. What I'm going to focus on is two key stories here. The first is the Crosby Mill, which was a grist mill at the base of the lower falls. And the second is the Ward and Hayes Company sawmill at the top of the upper falls. Each is a very important story about the imposition of dams and wing dams, the diversion of water, and what this means ecologically for salmon in 1854 and 1855. But before that, I want to go back and talk a little more about the river, because this is at the same exact spot, but just a different shot from a slightly different perspective of the area. And what you can see is the river is actually a mess. But this is nothing new. There's nothing particularly odd about this. All the Northwest rivers were filled with debris at various places. And in looking at this, what we see as a mess, what a modern biologist sees is really good salmon habitat, because in most cases, all of this woody debris that sits down on the shallows of various rivers is not actually blocking salmon passage at this time. What it actually is doing is creating pools behind here that salmon can rest and stay in cool water. And equally important for young juvenile salmon, this woody debris creates great habitat for them to rear with lots of nutrients, but outside of the flow of the main stem of channel of the streams. So from a modern perspective, this is great habitat, not even just good habitat. And yet at the same time, it's filled with all sorts of obstructions. So we have to go gently in terms of thinking about what constitutes an important or possibly a debilitating obstruction and what doesn't at these moments. So let's get back to those mills. Well, the first of these is the Crosby Mill. It was actually built in 1847 by Michael Simmons, who was one of the original founders of Newmarket. It's a small grist mill, in other words, and it's located at the base of the falls. In 1850, well, let's look at the mill from the beginning. This is a photo of that mill, and among the things I want you to focus on is, this is like an oversized outhouse, really. And what you're seeing at the angle is the flume that feeds us. This is actually a structure that in some ways is much smaller than the very modest grist mills you'll find in places like Plymouth, Massachusetts, and other places. And technologically, not much has changed across time. When it's operating, there's a small flow going in and turning the wheel, but the vast majority of that water is staying in the main stem or in the main part of this stream, and it's really probably only being fed by a wing dam in these places, especially if it's drawing from the top of the upper falls, which this one was. So it has plenty of head and doesn't have to worry about creating a downward slope to feed the grist mill. Well, let's go back here for a second. Equally important is to understand that when Clanrick Crosby bought this in 1850, he carried on with this. Eventually, Crosby in 1863 will build a much larger mill, full 5 stories and all. But at this point in time, this is the technology we're actually talking about in terms of the lower falls grist mill. Now, if we move to the upper falls, what we'll see is another story. Ira Ward and Smith Hayes will buy the upper falls from Clanrick Crosby, who had bought the land all around these falls and really controlled industrial development in 1850 at this point in time. There they will erect a much larger sawmill and have a much greater intervention in the river. This is a shot from much later on. Originally, they had dammed the upper falls with logs, and in order to not simply divert water into the mill, which required much greater horsepower in order to drive, but also to create an impoundment so that they could float logs. The dam structure you're seeing here is much more formal and concretized by the late 19th century. And yet, if we look at this falls, it actually doesn't look much different from a lot of rapids that salmon were normally passing during this period. The falls was actually a much greater impediment at low water time, with or without the dam structure in place. So that again, while this is a larger structure and while it does impose some concerns about salmon habitat on the upper Deschutes as a result of this, it wasn't an impassable structure. And this is what we're going to find over and over during this period. What we're looking at here, in other words, is a really important story about nascent industrialism that becomes a harbinger of changes across time. But again, by the context that the court imposes of 1854 and 1855, this is not a particularly damaging set of developments that have taken place. More importantly, we need to think about the larger context of Western Washington at this period. In 1860, there were still less than 12,000 non-Indians living in Washington Territory, and that's spread across the entire area. Bud Inlet, New Market, Tumwater, and eventually New Market becomes Olympia, is probably as intensely developed as anywhere in Washington Territory at this point. And yet what we're seeing with these industrial developments is very little capital and very small interventions taking place. So while we're seeing the beginning of a story that will cause greater concern going forward, again, in 1854 and 1855, when the treaties are negotiated, it's not actually particularly intrusive at this point in time. Now, I want to take you to a second set of stories that complicates things even more. And in this case, I want to move north to Township 22, north 5 East. Now, this survey map was produced in 1865. So while it tells us some important things, and it doesn't in itself answer almost anything, and we're going to have to find all sorts of confirming evidence because this is beyond the temporal period of the treaties. But here we find really important stories that we can trace out and actually find multiple documents that help us contextualize each of these. What I want to look at particularly is really at the confluence of the Cedar River coming from the east as it joins the now extinct Black River that was flowing out of what at that point in time was known as Lake Duwamish, what will become Lake Washington shortly thereafter. And to drill it down even more, it's really this area right here. There are several things emerging at this point that are really important to look at in all this. But first, let's talk about the Black River. It is a larger stream than the Deschutes by quite a measure. It's also a much lower gradient stream. Coming out of Lake Washington, it falls a little bit, but then very quickly slows down and joins that flooded plain that it shares with the Duwamish, the Green, the White, and the Puyallup River. So it's very slow going. It tends to be a darker stream than the Deschutes, and it places it's pretty deep. Put another way, this is not a great indigenous fishing stream. You have to make much more intensive interventions in order to find effective places to capture salmon at this point in time. So again, this is from later. This is a shot from 1910, but it gives you a sense about the hydrology of this place. This is actually only a few years before the Black River will disappear. Its death happens in July of 1916. I'll get the century right eventually here, when the canal cut is completed and the lake is lowered significantly in height, and the Cedar River is rerouted into Lake Washington at that point in time. But back to this map. There are three sites here I want to talk about. The first is the cropping of stone coal. The second is Henry Tobin's homestead on the east side of the river. And the third is this Sammamish village just south of Tobin's homestead. They're all actually entangled, and they all tell very interesting stories that we need to think about. But again, the map doesn't tell us anything useful for the understanding of the treaties because it's produced 10 years too late in this respect. But there are a lot of people who are writing about these very sites. One comes from the surveyor notes that are being produced during this period at this time. The second, and they're reported to Congress during 1855 and 1856. The second is one of the surveyors in general, George Gibbs, who was with the survey crew, but his portfolio was not so much mapping out the cadastral dimensions of the surveys, but of taking notes on the various tribes around Western Washington. He's going to have a lot to tell us in all this. And then there will be other reports we'll have to refer to as well. Because let's start with the cropping of the stone coal. What do they mean by this? Well, in one of the surveyor's reports, they note that, well, first, Gibbs had visited the stone coal and noted that it was a face of about 15 feet wide, about 6 feet deep, not a very large site for mining. But he did notice it. And then the surveyors who come through also notice all important natural resources, and coal by this point in time is very important. The surveyor wrote about one particular individual who claimed that it was, quote, the best specimen of American cannel coal he had ever seen. Well, what's cannel coal? Well, it's actually, it's a spongy category between bituminous coal and the bitumen that's mined in northern Alberta at the tar sands. It is supposedly very rich in energy, and thus it attracts a lot of attention in all this. When I went to go back and assess this, because quoting, for me, a surveyor quoting somebody else who is not particularly well identified and whose credentials are not very clear, I need to find other information as well. So in this particular case, I went to a second document. I rooted around and eventually found a state of Washington geology report from 1912, in which geologist George Watkin Evans visited this site and reclassified it as what he called subbituminous, and then noted that the mine had been operated, quote, in a small way until 1855, because the coal beds were, again, quote, so impure that they do not pay to operate. So once we get past the sometimes boosterish rhetoric that we find in some of these surveys, we get a much clearer sense of what this meant. It, in fact, was a coal mine, but it wasn't very intensively used. It wasn't used for very long, and it was more or less shut down by the middle part of 1855 when the tensions rise between the Western tribes and the territorial government as a result of the treaties during this period. So we have a potential site where mining, which can be damaging to salmon habitat, could have taken, but it doesn't seem to have actually happened very much in this particular case. This leads us to Tobin, Henry Tobin's homestead. Now, Tobin is one of the early settlers at Renton, a very important individual in terms of developing some of the early industries. The most important for him was his sawmill. To erect this, because the Black River was a low gradient stream, he built a dam all the way across the river that, according to both the surveyors and to Gibbs, raised the water level of the river 6 full feet. There's more to that story going forward, but it was enough to create a head in order for him to drive his sawmill. Gibbs in particular spent quite a bit of time looking at the mill and writing about it. We get a good sense that it's a fairly substantial mill and that the dam itself was fairly substantial, probably 7 to 8 feet of height, probably about 7 to 8 feet of height above the lower foot of the dam. So again, a really substantial structure, really important. Let's figure out what it actually, how much damage it causes. And here's where the Mammoth Village turns out to be really important for us, because for all his descriptions about this, that village turns out to really change the way we understand this particular structure. The Sammamish had not originally been at this site. They had in fact been upstream from Tobin's structure and had been flooded out by the dam itself. It had flooded both their potato fields and their village enough that they saw fit to move south of the structure at the bottom of his homestead in this respect. Now, my reflex looking at this is they must have been very upset about this. Well, that wasn't actually the case, because when he goes to the site and begins to interview the Indians, because that was his actual reason for being on the Black River, was to come and survey the Indians and write about their language and write about their structures, because they're actually in January in the midst of negotiating the Point Elliott Treaty at this very moment in time. And while he's there, he comes upon a number of different stories that really complicate our understanding. And it begins with that they had been flooded out, but at the same time, they had taken he reports that they took great interest in the dam and understood its workings very well. According to Gibbs, the Sammamish were, quote, very proud of the mill because, quote, it conferred an honor on their country, because in their minds, they're still sovereign at this point in time. And legally, because the treaty has not been finalized yet, they actually were. But the honor it brings is not simply because there's now a structure there that's generating money and changing things. It's actually because of what the dam does for the fishery. What he notes is that the dam had, quote, improved their fishery, which is very valuable. By putting up a permanent structure there, they didn't have to go and build their annual weirs anymore across the stream in order to slow down the fish so that they could trap and net them. The dam now provided that obstruction, and they could wade out and do this. And more importantly, by the structure being there, they also controlled access for other groups who wanted to come and fish at the dam as well. So it did enhance their fishery and their local power as a result of this structure, which they regarded as part of their country in this respect. So you get a dam story that turns out to be more complicated. From this, however, we still have to infer something, which is, do the fish pass or not? And the evidence for here is not conclusive one way or the other, but it doesn't seem to have alarmed the Sammamish in 1855 at this point in time. And the dam had been in place for a while. So it may have been the case that the fish could pass the dam. It would not have been that extraordinary for fish to swim over a dam that was overtopping itself only 6 to 8 feet above. That's not an unheard of climb for fish, for salmon migrating upstream. But I can't conclude conclusively one way or the other whether this actually obstructed or not. And this is part of the problem of doing research at the time. People don't always ask the questions you want to get answered at this point in time. So this is an example of a structure that is certainly much more formidable than the Ward and Hayes Dam at the top of the lower falls of, or the upper falls, excuse me, of the Deschutes. Much more substantial and thus open to more questions here. But in the overall scheme, I also have to note that the vast majority of the streams have no obstructions on them at this point in time. So this is where I get left on this. I can't answer every last question conclusively, and yet at the same time, I'm forced to write this up, because what we're left with is actually a fairly congenial relationship between a property owner owning a dam and a village that had been disrupted by the dam at one level, but another had decided that it was actually a net advantage to them because of this. The implication suggests that it didn't have any egregious effect on the salmon, but I can't say that either conclusively. in this respect. So when I sit down to write my report, I have to balance all these things and come to a conclusion that talks about what we can know, but also what we can't know in terms of development, how it's affecting both salmon runs and salmon habitat at the time. And this becomes part of this, the report that I file with the tribes in all this. And this is where I want to leave you with this, because the Culvert case is very much about now, the now and the next. It's very much about how these treaties still speak to us at this point in time and what their implications are for how we manage salmon in the present and the future, not only in terms for people, but in terms for fish themselves going forward. And yet for all that, and much like William Faulkner's great quotation from Requiem for a Nun, the past is never dead. It's not even past. In many, many ways, in order to talk about these treaties in the present, we still have to embed ourselves in 1854 and 1855 to understand as best we can what the world looked like and what people thought about these events at this point in time. And rather than going on, because I've probably gone too long already here, I want to shift over to the questions part. So from that perspective, thank you very much. And let's get on to the questions here. Try and get out of this.
Right.
There we go. Great.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was very interesting. Okay, everyone, we will now be taking questions. So if anyone has any questions, again, the Q&A button should be at the bottom of the screen for most of you, I believe. I actually had a question. I was following along, but I was thinking about, you were talking about how the dam had in turn brought more of the fish. They were able to catch more fish, but was that Black River, did it have a lot of fish beforehand, or was it the dam that kind of brought them over?
No, well, what the dam does is obstruct passage, and it creates a constraint that makes it much more effective to go out and wade into the river, because you know that there are a lot of fish right there. This is why people are, indigenous people are attracted to the lower, middle, and upper falls at the Deschutes, or the Dalles on the Columbia River, and a whole lot of other places. It's these places where the river constrains itself by falls or riffles that human beings have figured out these are the best places to go. I know when the fish are coming, and more importantly, I know exactly where I need to go to catch these things. And this is why indigenous groups around our entire quadrant of the continent lay claims to all these good sites. The Black River doesn't have any good sites, so the dam actually creates good sites. The runs are already there, and they're moving both up the Black River into and through Lake Duwamish into Lake Samoset, or not Sammamish, excuse me, but also up the Cedar River. So they all have runs already. What the dam does is it just makes it for a far more convenient place to go and catch.
Okay, I see. And you had mentioned that the Native American people that had lived on the land, what form of or technique were they using to catch the fish before the dam? I heard you mention it, and
well, there are a lot of different techniques, and the technologies used depend on sites sometimes, or seasons sometimes.
Okay.
And there's a whole side to this story that I haven't told here, which is about the indigenous fisheries. But they use, they're using a wider range of technologies. From some people get in canoes and go paddling around the water with hook and lines. But when they want to catch a lot of fish, they either go to these obstructions or they create obstructions, and then they catch them with spears, nets, and traps of various sorts that they weave and create in these places. And in some cases, such as the Black River, or another good example is the Chehalis River to the south of the Chutes, where they build essentially wooden structures of branches and other things to create essentially a gated structure across the entire river. And then they set up stands or they create traps that induce fish to go through them but get captured in baskets and what have you. And they can be incredibly efficient at certain moments of the year because they need to be. They're capturing during especially the fall runs, they're trying to capture as many fish as they can, as fast as they can, so that they can overwinter and not have to pursue their seasonal food quests so much during this period. So there's a period of very intense harvest. And once they have what they want, both for domestic consumption for subsistence, but also for trade, because Indigenous people are always trading as well. And they're really important going forward in terms of feeding travelers, but also early settlers, and they are engaged in market fishing as well during this period of time. So how much they're fishing, how much they're catching is changing across this period as well as a result of this. But their technologies are really wide. They'll use drift nets, seine nets, gill nets, dip nets, and what have you. And when you stand back, you realize they're more or less using exactly the same technologies as everybody else around the world. In this respect. And it just depends on where and what works best at what time.
Interesting, thank you. We do have a question here. How are the Indians doing today with the fishing rights?
Right now, this is an ongoing contest, and the state of Washington, and to now a lesser extent, the state of Oregon, have overwhelmingly lost the vast majority of their arguments on this, but that doesn't mean they've stopped arguing about this. And I can't explain fully the rationale behind why the state of Washington has pursued so many losing cases across time, but they have. So it's not a guarantee that the rule of law as it stands right now in terms of the interpretation of treaties will carry on into the future. But right now, it seems to me fairly settled law based on the string of cases going back to the 19th century that treaty holding tribes largely stand outside the purview of the state government in terms of managing fisheries, that during the 1970s, especially in the 1980s, they developed the scientific capacity to be co-equal managers of fisheries during that time, that they manage their own fisheries and have their own allocation battles among each other through both the Puget Sound group and the Columbia River group. Because they're treaty holders in Oregon as well as Washington that are also implicated by all these rulings. And based on the Culvert case, now an expectation that there will be salmon because the treaties impose a mandate to maintain habitat. So that's where it stands right now. And some of the most heated battles at this point take place among the treaty holding tribes, not between them and non-Indian fishers.
Okay. This question says, I noticed that there were certain areas of Washington not involved in this set of treaties, notably the Northeast and Southwest corners. Do the same legal cases apply to these areas?
That's an open question because in some cases there are no treaties, and this is one of the problems that I teach at Simon Fraser University, which is in British Columbia, which in late 1860s and early 1870s simply decided never to negotiate with any of the Indigenous people here. As a result, there are no treaties. And this is as a result, in terms of the broader legal culture, there has never been established actual title. So you've got an entire province, much larger than British Columbia, where this is an ongoing land claims issue. Well, there are quadrants of Washington where those land claims are still outstanding, one of which it's not so much the far northeast, but the far southwest, because there were treaties that were negotiated with Chinookan-speaking people on the lower Columbia River and all the way up to Shoalwater Bay and portions of Shoalwater Bay, but those treaties were never ratified. So that is an outstanding issue as well. So there are a variety of cases, and there are donut holes all over the place in Western North America, where the government still needs to clean up its act in this respect. So land claims, while it encompasses the entirety of British Columbia, is actually not just their story. It's going on in a lot of different places.
This question says, on Felicia's point, what did the lowering of Lake Washington bring to your conclusions in your study?
Well, that goes right, well after my period of study, because it happens in the early it happens with the creation of the ship canal in 1916. And as a result, it's really not directly implicated in the treaty cases, or at least it hasn't been so far. But what the draining does is it diverts the Cedar River, so that essentially all waters from those watersheds now flow right through the middle of Seattle, past the University of Washington. Go watch the Windermere Cup and you see essentially the end of the Cedar River and Lake Sammamish in these places. But over time, it also creates a crisis, because having lost that, salmon runs to these streams decline very, very sharply, because where they used to go, they can't go anymore. There's no Black River. And thus, as a result, what you're going to see in really the post-war period, that it starts earlier. It starts in the 1920s with the University of Washington's new fisheries school. But it's really in the post-war period that they'll start very intensively at the university creating their own hatchery and beginning to create a new Indigenous sockeye run. Based first at the University of Washington, but with the goal eventually of repopulating both the Cedar River and Lake Sammamish. And over time, they'll be successful in this. At times, it waxes and wanes, but it's a very strange story, because it's a thoroughly relocated watershed system that essentially has its mouth through one of the more industrialized portions of the Puget Sound in that respect. So it changes across time.
This question says, has the Black River totally disappeared? Can you get into more detail about the former course of the Black River?
Well, what happens to much of the Black River, because the water ceases to drown out of it, is it becomes, it doesn't cease to be a conduit for water, but it ceases to have any strong feed. So what you will get is intermittent runs in that stream, and over time it gets very intensively developed. But there's still a thread to that, but there's no actual river there anymore, because there's no feed to it anymore in that respect. So it's a curious case, because it's, when you tell Washingtons you have an extinct river, what are you talking about? But running right through the middle of Renton is an old watershed that hasn't stopped being a watershed, because water follows gravity, and this all still live. But it's much closer to the story of, say, the LA River than it is to anything else in that respect, although not concretized to the same extent.
This question is asking, could a recovery of the Deschutes estuary return salmon to 1854 level?
This gets into a story right now about the ecology of not simply the rivers, but the ecology of the oceans. And this is really not just the Deschutes. This is a $64,000 question for the entire region right now, because increasingly, we can make really good habitat right now, but the main driver of runs is ocean health. And between the blob and general warming, between intermittent El Niños, especially intense El Niños, and acidification, the ocean's not producing salmon at the same level that it used to. And this is the main crisis going forward. We're battling over dams on the Snake River and a lot of other places, but it's the oceans that are really the driving force of the story at this point. And it really is tied up with climate change.
Okay, that looks like that was the last question in our Q&A box here. Let's see here. Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask? And then also, Erin, would you like to ask any questions? Do you have anything you wanted to ask about?
Thank you, but I don't. What a great talk. Thank you so much.
It was really good.
And thank you, Felicia. This has been, I've really enjoyed this. So.
Yeah, it has been a lot of fun. It's very interesting to learn about this. Yes, chat box says great presentation. Thank you. From Greg.
It really is my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, so all right, so I think that will wrap up for this evening. It has been a great discussion. Again, thank you, Dr. Taylor, for the talk, and then thank you to everyone who has joined us today. All right, so have a great night, everyone.
Thank you very much.